Loud and clear. All right, you may start.
Okay. Okay, great. We'll get started. My name is Courtney O'Connell, your chair for panel 1 of the American University of Paris' conference, The Psychology of Global Crises, State Surveillance, Solidarity, and Everyday Life. Welcome and thanks for being here. This panel contains 3 parts. First, we'll be hearing from Angela Veale and Naomi Machete with a 20-minute presentation followed by 10 minutes of discussion. Then I'll also share a 15-minute video with you, followed by 10 minutes of discussion. Finally, we'll watch a pre-recorded presentation from Professor Dato Yusuf Roque, Santos, and Sharima Morales, who, due to unreliable internet in the Philippines, will be unable to join us for a live discussion, as far as we know. So without further ado, please give your attention to Angela and Naomi.
Great, thank you very much, Courtney. So Naomi and I are based in Cork in Ireland, and our presentation, we both work with refugee and migrant communities here, and today we're going to look at the idea that crisis is not kind of a one-off thing, obviously, but there are communities that are experiencing crisis as an ongoing phenomenon, but the nature of it changes. So we're going to focus on Syrian refugee communities and migrant communities more generally in Cork, Ireland. So I'm going to start the presentation by situating our presentation in a review of the literature of the past 2 years on the Syrian communities in the region, Syrian refugees in the region, in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, etc., and then in Western countries, and then present a little data on Syrian refugees in Ireland in relation to that. And then Naomi is going to give an example of how she is working with migrant communities to adapt to the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm just going to go and try and share my screen now. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, this is new for me to be just using Zoom for this, so let's see. Has that shared my screen or not? No, I don't think so.
We can see it, Angela.
Can you see the slides? So, sorry, let me just see. So what are you looking at now? Can you see the slide or are you seeing me?
We see the slide.
Okay, great. Okay, so the title of our presentation is Crisis-Driven Social Change in the Case of Syrian Refugee and Other Migrants in Ireland. So a lot of sociocultural psychology has focused recently on the concepts of rupture and transition. And for Syrian refugees, the unrest in Syria was a consequence of the Arab Spring, which led to one of the bloodiest civil wars in the Middle East, which has had profound consequences for children's lives, for adolescents that are making a transition to adulthood, and for families. We can see that over 5.5 million Syrian refugees have crossed the national borders to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. And children make up half of this displaced population. And by 2019, an additional over 1 million Syrian refugee babies were born in countries in the region, many of whom will have no legal status, which will impact their lives going forward. But what we see in the literature is that precariety is at the heart of the experiences of crisis, with impacts on agency and the sense of kind of being thrown around by events and having very, very little control. So what we see with disruption of the usual processes of living is massive change to functioning people. So crisis and transition calls for developmental change. But in the case of the Syrian refugees, what we could argue is the change is what Dato would call intransitive change. It's a change from which there is no going back. There is only a movement forward. So it's a crisis that precipitates leaving behind everything you've known. So there's a change life course, a rupture in experience from which there is no going back, and which requires a re-navigation of the person's social world environment dynamics. The impact of the crisis on children and families has been severe. I'm sharing with you some art produced in a project with Syrian refugees by Roque with Fiona Shannon and colleagues in Chantilla camp in Lebanon, where a group of women were involved in this art making project. So I think these images are really beautiful. But what the literature from the past 2 years is showing is the profound effect of the impact and experience of the crisis on children and adolescents in particular. So Syrian refugee children have experienced high levels of exposure to war-related traumatic events, with studies reporting a mean of about 4 and 5 traumatic events, including over 90% of children have experienced armed conflict, 60% have seen someone kicked, shot, physically hurt, 60% have experienced a threat to self or other, about half have experienced the loss of somebody they cared about. And in the 2-year period of the studies that are reviewed, between a third and a half of displaced children and adolescents scored above the clinical cutoff score for post-traumatic stress disorder syndromes. Interestingly, gender has been significantly related to psychological outcomes, and adolescent girls and young women are particularly evidencing poorer well-being. Girls reported, this is in the region now, girls reported a greater appraisal of danger, more internalizing post-traumatic stress symptoms, higher mean depression and anxiety scores, and higher PTSD syndromes. One of the hypotheses around that is that for girls, they're kept home for their security, leading to greater social isolation, or if they have to go out to contribute for income for the family, it leads them to greater risk of harassment, particularly sexual harassment. So there's 3 kind of questions that I kind of ask of the literature in response to crisis. How does crisis reconfigure the person's social world environmental dynamics? The interplay developmental trajectories and social change, and the future life trajectories. What we see in families is there is a massive change in kind of roles, norms around gender and family roles, as the roles for family members have changed. So it's usual for men to be the head of households, but in the region and in the West, it's been difficult for men to get work, and often it's easier for women to find jobs in the either informal economy or the normal economy. So the traditional family roles have changed, which creates massive pressures. There's also an interplay between developmental trajectories and social change and crisis. So the kind of pattern for kind of moving to adulthood roles has changed. In the region, certainly both boys and girls have been forced into the labour market to support families. In a study of Syrian refugee young boys working in the Lebanese scrap metal industry, boys were aware they were labelled as nawar, a disparaging label with the connotations of being unclean or dishonourable. And boys talked about growing up being told by Lebanese neighbours that Syrian bodies can sustain work under all conditions, including filth and extreme temperatures. And they resist this through kind of playfulness, irony, and trying to imagine a future that is kind of like a post-conflict future. So imagination and trying to imagine things becoming better is part of this. Future life trajectories are completely altered in unimaginable ways. And particularly for young adults, they have to try and cope with being in environments that are changed as a result of being out of their normal schooling environments, not having the social capital to help them into the labour market, and all of that. Studies in Western contexts, for those that have resettled in Canada, the US, and other countries, are finding similar kind of patterns, elevated risks of elevated levels of PTSD symptomology. And for example, a study in Canada reported experiences of discrimination, bullying, and racism. And both in the region and in the Western world, there is a question whether for Syrian refugees, they're being set up for a possible life trajectory that includes future exclusion in high-income countries in the West. In Ireland, with the HSC, Mariko Wyrock led a study that looked at resettlement of Syrian refugees in Quark and Kerry. So there was initially 23 families in Kerry and 21 families in Quark. All families had been here for 2 years, and we looked at mental health outcomes and some of the resettlement difficulties. And similar to the studies that are reported in the region and other parts of the world, adults in particular show high levels of symptomology, particularly for PTSD and anxiety. So 61% of adults had symptomology for PTSD above the cutoff level, and 34% for anxiety and 45% for depression. And again, mirroring some of the findings in the region, the level of symptomology was higher for females than for males. So even though in Ireland, Syrian refugees are quite, those that came in under UNHCR program are quite privileged in relation to asylum seekers that come in more informally, insofar as they immediately get refugee status, they get support with getting kids into school, they get support with English language lessons, housing, etc. Still, 57% reported over 5 on a distress thermometer, but 2/3 of them felt able to cope with daily stressors. In terms of rupture and this notion of intransient change and that, you know, things can't go back, one of the major experiences is social isolation and difficulties with social integration. So for the Syrian refugees in Ireland, there isn't waves of other earlier waves of other refugees from the Middle East. So really they are kind of forging a new path. It's a brave path, but it is leading to isolation and difficulties with social integration. Children actually are doing quite well because they've got the school system to integrate with. Those on the transition between kind of from adolescence to young adulthood are probably the ones that are struggling most because they've experienced most rupture. And adults are experiencing poor integration, feeling isolated, and high levels of unemployment. So that's a very brief run through both what the international literature has to say and the experiences from Ireland of being a refugee. And so the rupture and crisis lead to a set of ongoing crises. There isn't a sense of a stable moment in this. And after arriving here for 2 years ago in Ireland, then there was the work of trying to resettle, the kind of coming up against the barriers to that. And now COVID-19 has overlaid another layer of crisis where everybody's experiencing a sense of isolation and a breakdown in their social support networks. But it is particularly the case for refugees and those that already are kind of on the margins of these social networks. So now I'm going to pass over to Naomi, who's with the Quark Migrant Centre, and she's going to talk to us about what they are doing in relation to COVID-19 with migrants, including Syrian migrants. Naomi, would you be able to share your screen?
I will try to do that.
Hang on now, I'll stop sharing mine.
Oh, you have to stop here.
Thank you, Angela. That was really interesting.
Yeah. You have to get yourself the screen.
Is mine still on the screen?
Yeah. Yes, Angela, maybe you can click stop sharing if you haven't already. Yeah, now it's just you. That's a good first step.
I am very new at this, so I don't know. Do I just click on my screens, on my slide?
Yeah, try clicking on yours. I'll just stop my video.
On the bottom, Naomi, you should see a share screen button.
And then it shows my slide. Should I do select, how we do application? I'm clicking on my, oh, is that it?
Yes, I think, yep, we can see your slides now. You could maybe go into full screen there.
Oh, brilliant. Oh. Does that work?
Yeah, lovely, Naomi. We can see your slides now. Thank you.
Okay, so fantastic. So I work with Angela. I work in a place called the Quark Migrant Center. And what it is a psychosocial well-being hub. And normally what happens is that migrants, including like Angela just talked about, the isolation and kind of the displacement and they're out of step when they get into the country. And what happens is that in this psychosocial hub, we create a safe space where migrants can come in and meet and just really form social networks. And over and above that, we kind of have empowering kind of workshops. So basically, it's based on the psychosocial model that is really used in humanitarian settings. And that's kind of looking at the enhancing the capacities emotionally, because they are very, like Angela talked about, their emotional levels in terms of knowledge, because they don't even know the knowledge about the country. They don't know, they're unfamiliar with the parenting skills, they're unfamiliar with the education system. So it's really an orientation space, and also to we also look at the needs that they have and try to kind of address those needs. So very organically evolving interventions. And over and above that, one of the biggest thing that we do at the center is linkages. So we link them to other things. We might link them to other organizations. We might link them to other community groups that are similar to theirs. We might link them to education opportunities. So it's a lot of enhancing capacities and linkages. Okay. When COVID-19 happened, everyone got dislocated, because they were coming to the center from the different places. So they were coming from the communities where they were settled. And then a lot of them were coming through the informal system, through the application process, in Ireland, when people seek asylum, they are housed in what we call direct provision centers. And these centers are across the country. And where we work in Cork, there's about 7 direct provision centers. And some of the people students and families that were coming to the center were from those direct provision centers, and the migrants who were settled in the community, including the Syrians. With COVID-19 came the lockdown. And with the lockdown, obviously, a lot of unprecedented impact on the psychological, physical. They could never have, they couldn't go out like everybody else in the country. So this happened, and they couldn't come, they couldn't come out. And particularly for the people who are living in the direct provision centers, it was particularly more stressful, because they're very congested, and families don't have own door accommodation settings. So very communal sharing. And so even in terms of the government recommendations of social distancing and good hygiene, it was really difficult to get this in the congested settings of direct provision settings. So they were going through the fear and anxiety that all of us were going through during COVID-19. And for them, particularly people in direct provision centers, were then had this overly anxiety of not being able to socially isolate, and probably not even have enough hygiene products for the hand washing and so on. And also, like everybody else, they had lost, for those who are working, they had lost their jobs as well. So really going through the difficulty. And actually, at the time that the government was very quick to step up and respond to the crisis, these women that we work mostly with women. The women who are living in the direct provision centers and the families that we work with actually were able to step up and see what can they do in their own right to respond to this crisis. So at a time when people are feeling helpless and powerless, they actually say they could give something to the crisis. And what happened was that before the crisis at the center, the women that we work with in terms of the psychosocial interventions were involved in a sewing project where they were sewing headbands and doing a lot of crafts really as a way of healing and a recovery model. So what we did is they said, look, we could, so they were asking for different things, and they were looking for masks, because like I said, inability to self-isolate and a way to try and protect themselves. And they said, look, we are looking for masks, but we could make the masks. And so they put that to us, and we said, actually, you could make the masks, hygiene masks, face masks, because you are sewing at the center before this started. So what happened, that was then the birth of this crisis-driven initiative that we started, which we call the Sanctuary Initiative. And in this Sanctuary Initiative, what we did is that very quickly, between ourselves, And the university in Cork, where Angela works, UCC University College Cork, and another charity, we came together and formed a working group very strategically. What can we do very quickly to respond to the crisis? We put up the funds that we had. We started a GoFund campaign, and we said we could actually support and facilitate these women that we work with to actually make hygiene masks for themselves to try and do something. So really a sense of agency for these women who, I mean, and for migrants generally, they are often viewed through a deficit lens where they are not viewed as people who can contribute anything to the society, often viewed in terms of as recipients of events and of things. So for this was really empowering for them to say, we can actually do something to protect ourselves. So very quickly we got together and we raised a campaign and mobilized sewing machines. Just on the day of the lockdown, we were able to take them to all the different women that were involved in the center across Cork. We were able to get fabric, and we were able to get this because at the center, the interventions that we were doing involved sewing. So we were able to mobilize the fabric that we had and send it very quickly to the women, thread and other sewing, other materials. And the women then got, and one of them actually was a very good seamstress, even back from home. So she was able to do templates that were then sent to the other seamstresses, ensuring that all the masks were of the same standard and the same size. So they were shared through video and through Zoom meetings. And at the end, this is kind of the product of what they did were really good masks, face masks for men and for women and for children. So here is the picture of all the women that were involved in the project, and really proud of it. It was really a very empowering aspect at the individual level, sense of agency. We have done this, they are made with love. And within over 4 weeks, these women had made over 6,000 masks, which were enough for each and every person in the direct provision centers in Cork, man, child, and woman, and even for themselves. And now they've actually started giving them to the local community, to the local communities, other vulnerable communities in the center. So in a way, really changing the social fabric and the community and being seen again from this deficit sense as lens, as recipients to people who can actually do something, people who have joined COVID-19 as a response that's making a big impact. And in Ireland, actually, I think just this week, the Taoiseach has recommended that the public should wear face masks when they go out in public. So this has come at a very timely, at a good time when this has become such an essential product in the market. So for them to produce that, it's really kind of changing the narrative. So these women have become participants of people, a very key factor of the people who are responding to the COVID-19 crisis, and actually in style. Because if you look at the masks that they are making, they are really beautiful. And there's a lot of social media, a lot of visibility. And again, so that's just an example of how the migrants in Ireland have joined the COVID-19, fighting the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi.
Yeah. So how do I exit them?
I think you can go to stop sharing. Yeah, good.
Naomi, there's a question for you in the chat feature. Yeah. It says, the Irish government was quick to act, but did not go far enough. What would have been some actions that they should have taken quicker?
What they'd have taken quicker, and we were also advocating as well, was to thin out the direct provision centers. Because what was happening in the direct provision centers where asylum seekers are housed is that there was no own-door family accommodation. So there were like different family members sharing a room, and that was really difficult. So what we were really trying to advocate is to thin out these direct provision centers so that people then were able to self-isolate.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you very much. We still have a little bit of time if there's any other questions. I don't know. Can we only receive them in the chat, actually? I guess we're not able to hear from any other participants, no? Like outside of the chat.
That's what the Q&A section is for questions.
Yeah, so this is the Q&A portion for Angela and Naomi. And we still have a good 6 minutes left if there's any more questions.
No, maybe we can move on and we can always take more at the end if they come up then.
Okay. So then I'll introduce myself. I'm Courtney from Long Island, New York. I studied art there at Queens College, and I've been living and working in Berlin since 2009. I received a master's last year in children's rights and childhood studies from the University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam. Right now, I'm also working in the field of urban development with a focus on children and youth participation in city planning processes. I also work part-time at the refugee shelter that will be the focus of this presentation. Okay, so this is a pre-recorded video that I'll play for you now. It's 15 minutes, and then afterwards I welcome your questions. Okay, so now I'm up to scramble around and try to share my screen. Okay, so. Okay, you guys can see that? Yeah, okay, thank you, Naomi. Here is an overview of what I'll be presenting now. I'll provide some context about people seeking asylum in Berlin. Then I'll walk you through examples of how we're responding to the pandemic, specifically remote homework mentorships and a virtual film camp, and how the groundwork that we laid in pre-corona times helped make this possible. In 2016, approximately 1.3 million people came to Germany as refugees, 30% of them children. Initially, people were placed in emergency shelters, usually converted gyms or sport halls. I volunteered in one that was an old tobacco factory. Rows of bunk beds were separated by sheets and contained up to 2,000 people at a time. After an average of between 1 and 2 years in an emergency shelter, people were relocated to smaller temporary shelters dispersed around the city. Today, there are 10 arrival centers and 74 communal housing facilities for asylum seekers in Berlin, with 20,155 people living in them. In late 2016, 17 so-called container villages or temple homes were built around Berlin. They're owned by the city, controlled by the State Office for Refugee Accommodations, and operated by the state or various social welfare NGOs. These 17 locations were intended to remain in operation for a total of 3 years until more permanent housing facilities were built. It's now been 3.5 years, and 13 of the temple homes are still there today. In March of 2017, I began working as a child and youth counselor at one of the temple homes, which I will refer to this point on as the camp. Right now, there are 193 people living at the camp, 60 people under the age of 18. 47 of the camp's residents are from Afghanistan, 30 from Iraq, and the rest of the population consists of people from Moldova, Russia, Albania, Turkey, Chechnya, Armenia, Vietnam, Eritrea, Somalia, and 15 other countries. The length of time people stay at the shelter varies widely. People are sometimes deported not long after arrival. Large families have trouble finding big enough apartments, and due to an extreme lack of available or affordable housing in Berlin right now, people typically remain in shelters for much longer than initially anticipated. Length of stay in a shelter also has to do with one's asylum status, which is affected by one's country of origin. UN refugee status is very rare. Subsidiary protection is given to many Syrians, for example. This means you receive permission to stay for 3 years with the possibility of extending one's stay after that point. By contrast, people from Afghanistan typically receive the status of toleration, which means you're not allowed to be deported, but you're also not encouraged to integrate into society and stay long term. Of the 193 residents currently living at the camp, 44 have been living there since it opened in 2016. The residents in the camp are far removed from the culture and diversity that draws so many people to Berlin. This is a picture of the street just opposite the camp. It's a sleepy, quiet neighborhood on the very outskirts of the greater Berlin area. Many neighbors protested the construction of the facility at the start and continue to complain about its existence today. I'll give you a window into the camp now through the eyes of some of its young residents. These photos were taken with disposable cameras in 2017 by kids who were 7, 9, and 11 years old at the time. This is the front entrance of the camp. The gates in the front there are only open when a vehicle has to come in. Everyone, residents, employees, and guests alike, have to go through the security container there on the left and present their IDs upon arrival. There are 8 security guards on duty at the camp at any given time. The entire property is surrounded by a fence. Government officials say the fences were initially put up to protect residents from attacks by right-wing extremists. In 2016, when the camp was built, there were 1,031 reported attacks on refugee shelters across Germany. Each Temple Homes facility has a container for social services offices and laundry facilities, which you can see in the foreground on the left side of this photo. There are a total of 64 living units in 7 containers in the camp. Each unit consists of 2 13-square-meter rooms, separated by a small kitchen and bathroom. 4 adults usually occupy 1 unit. Families with children usually have a whole one to themselves. This here is a highly disputed piece of land. The kids cleared away all the stones from this area so they could use it for a soccer field. We put grass down, and as soon as they started playing, a neighbor directly across the street started complaining on an almost daily basis to the security guards, to the director of the camp, to the city of Berlin, and to the Federal Agency for Refugee Accommodations. This leads to new rules being continuously instated, broken, and renegotiated. One container is also home to community rooms, a shared kitchen, a TV room, a playroom, women's room, a sports room, and a tutoring room. They're all in that container that you see in the back of this photo here. Homework help used to be offered there every weekday before the pandemic. In the 2017-2018 school year, 1.2 million of 11 million students in Germany, or 10.7%, were without a German passport. The city of Berlin set up so-called welcome classes, essentially separate classes for foreign children. In many schools, this meant little to no interaction with the greater student population and effectively excluded welcome class students from social and extracurricular activities. The purported goal of welcome classes is that new students learn German as quickly as possible so they can become matriculated into mainstream classes. However, by keeping non-German speaking children apart from their German speaking peers, their opportunity to speak and acquire language skills is severely hampered. There are no countrywide or even citywide standards for welcome classes. There is no set curriculum. Teachers do not need to be qualified to teach German as a foreign language or to teach children. The German school system was already notorious for its inequality before 2015, with German students 3 times more likely than non-German students to be accepted into university. When the corona pandemic came, community rooms were closed, volunteers were no longer allowed in, and on-site staff was reduced. With schools closed, those who were already on the losing end of education inequality were going to face yet another wave of setbacks. The internet connection is weak at the camp. Almost none of the children have laptops on which they can make use of online learning platforms, and most parents are unable to help their kids with schoolwork as their German skills are usually poorer than the children's. Me and my colleague got a new phone to start a homework help hotline. We made flyers with the number on them and distributed them to the kids. Few called in though, so I got the idea to make it more personal by creating homework mentorships. First, I created an online survey in the beginning of April called Education Without School. where kids could tell us if they had homework and contact with their teachers, if they were able to do their assignments on their own, and if they wanted to take part in the program, where they would get assistance from an adult via WhatsApp. Some older children filled out the form themselves on their phones. I went to the camp, knocked on doors, and went through the questions with the rest of the children in person. If their parents approved, I collected their phone numbers. I got staff at the camp as well as people from 2 volunteer organizations I'm a part of to get involved. I matched them to the young people who wanted to take part, and currently 17 children receive one-on-one homework help from a total of 8 mentors via WhatsApp and Skype. For their first conversation, mentors and mentees can use a second online form I created to set goals for their homeschooling adventures. We received funding to be able to offer motivational gifts for children who participate. The children pick out the gifts with their mentors and receive them when they've met their homework goals. This has created an opportunity for the homework helpers to visit the camp and deliver the presents, sometimes meeting their mentees in person for the very first time. They are still not allowed inside of the camp, but we wear masks and walk around the neighborhood together in groups of 3. Only 3 of the 9 teenagers who live at the camp take part actively in the homework mentorship program. I am connected to the teens because we have been meeting on a weekly basis for over 2 years now, having youth meetups and taking field trips together. This is a flyer from one of our meetings. Once they asked if we could paint the communal TV room where they often hung out. We got permission from my boss and invited my comic artist friend Allie Fitzgerald to come help us out. I'd like to show you this clip from our painting weekend because I think it provides an excellent window into pre-corona intergenerational fun at the camp. The people whose faces can be seen in the video have given me permission to show you it. The majority of the teens at the camp attend a school notorious for poor quality of education, violence, and tensions between the school's immigrant population and German classmates. A member of the youth club told me that in a mock election, over 70% of students voted for the MPD party, which has a strong anti-immigrant agenda. When schools closed, I called one of the 15-year-olds up who goes to this school. He said he had received no homework and had had no contact with the school staff whatsoever. He and the other boys from the youth club had attended several filmmaking summer camps, which they loved. I found an offer for a digital film camp and signed him and a few of the other boys up, but there were no spots left. In a sort of pandemic-induced dream, I set out to create our own film camp with my partner and others in our volunteer organization. This took the form of a chat room, instruction via video, and support in the filmmaking process via phone calls and voice notes. The idea behind the digital film camp was not only to give participants something productive to work on in the absence of school, but also to help them make sense of the historical moment we're living through. We especially wanted to get them thinking about the link between how things are now and how they could be in the future. The boy who was the initial inspiration for the film camp found out towards the end of filming that he indeed did have homework all along and now had to scramble around to get it all done. So he was unfortunately unable to finish his film. 4 of the other boys, though, did indeed produce a short film. They have kindly given me permission to share this film with you now. We are not allowed to have in-person youth meetups again yet, but we still meet online for 2 hours once a week to touch base. Me or a colleague is there every weekday now for the kids, and we can help them with their homework in person. Luckily, the weather has been on our side, so we've been able to set up a little outdoor classroom, as you see here. My main aim over the past 3 years working at the camp has been to build relationships with young residents and their families personally, to promote connections among residents within the camp, and to connect residents to Berliners living outside of the camp. The online meetups, the digital film camp, and the homework mentorships have only been able to work because of the relationships that had already been built up before the crisis emerged. Supporting each other through the crisis will strengthen existing relationships and give way to new ones. It's important to emphasize that this support goes in both directions, as the work with the children gives us adults a sense of purpose and meaning that I think is especially hard to come by right now. It is my belief and my hope that these connections contribute to a sense of belonging that paves the way for a heightened sense of self-efficacy, again on the part of both young people and adults, that will help us all get through this together. Okay. So if anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the comments. And so somebody has written, Courtney, were all the images of the shelter that you showed in your presentation taken by young people who live there? Also, who do you interpret the after Corona segment of the video that was made? Yeah, so the one that was taken in the evening with that beautiful sunset, that picture I took, but the rest of them were taken by the children. And yeah, I interpret the after Corona segment of the video as a kind of like celebration of what is to come. Right now, we have kind of already reached that stage in Berlin to some extent. Although I have to say it's kind of unclear how things will proceed because there are some cases of Corona that are popping up in shelters now. So it's a little bit of a confusing moment, but I believe they are playing football together already at a distance now. So we'll see how this goes. Okay. Yes, and there's one more question. Thank you, Courtney, for your presentation. I am interested in new participatory action, and will this place survive? Yeah, so the inspiration for the homework mentorships was actually through a conversation with an 11-year-old girl who had lived at the camp for 2.5 years while I was working there and then had moved out. And I spoke to her and her father, and he was kind of losing his mind because he said he couldn't be a teacher and everything was so stressful, and she was struggling with her homework assignments. And so I intend on continuing to get feedback from the kids and seeing how we could build up the program. I'd like to create sort of virtual classrooms via WhatsApp where we can take on subjects like art and film and music. So far, it's a little bit of a slow go. We have kind of a pilot art class chat going right now, but I'll keep you posted, Ursula, about how that goes on. And we have received an extension to stay at this location until September 30th. The city is in the process of trying to take down all of the tempo homes, but this is the 4th time, I believe, that we have received an extension for a few months, which is always kind of a bittersweet thing. On the one hand, it's good that we can stay there longer and the kids can stay in their schools and maintain the friendships they've made in the community. On the other hand, it would be nice if people could move into more permanent housing, of course. Okay, and there's another question. At the University of Groningen, I have been a part of a research group on arts and education. with a specific focus on culture building via process-driven video projects. We should share research. Great job. Okay, I'm happy that I don't have to answer anything, and I look forward to that collaboration, Tim. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy that we're on time. And again, if there's any questions that come in for Angela and Naomi, hopefully we can get to them at the end. So I suppose now would be a good time to introduce our final panelists. Okay, one moment. Sorry, please bear with me. Just trying to get the information that Morales were kind enough to send me. Okay. Sorry, I had this prepared and now it's, of course, disappeared. Yes, okay. So the next presentation is from Yusuf Roque Morales. He is the Commissioner of the National Commission on Muslim Filipinos. He is both a member of the Academy and a government official addressing concerns of Muslims in the Philippines. He has written several articles, monographs, and conducted several research projects on Muslims in the Philippines, and has been one of the leading subject matter experts on prevention and countering violent extremism in the Philippines. Cheryl Shurima Morales is of the Polytech University of the Philippines. She is an associate professor and a curriculum development expert, technical vocation educator, and research and extension practitioner at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. Her research, together with the main author on Madrash education, excuse me for that pronunciation, won an outstanding research for an education in an international conference in Thailand. They have kindly submitted a video, which I will share with you now.
Discussion today would be primarily focused on the responses of fatwas of Islamic religious leaders and institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic in the Philippines. The objective is how do we look at how these Muslim religious institutions provided guidance to Muslim communities in the Philippines. Now, like all countries, the Philippines is a third world country that was affected by the COVID-19, and there are many positive and negative impacts on the country, and in which the government created policies to address this public health emergency. Like in other parts of the world, Islam in the Philippines is a mosaic, not a monolith, meaning it's composed of different organizations, institutions, and schools of thought, or what we call as the manahij, different understandings and interpretation of Islam. And in a way that Muslim Filipinos are diverse in the sense that they compose of 13 ethno-linguistic groups and around 19 schools of thoughts and many organizations belonging to these 9 denominations. This paper would like to look at how the responses were made by these institutions and what were the fatwas or the guidance that they've released in relation to COVID-19 and how the religious communities responded to the guidance provided. The data for this paper was taken from mixed sources, from official pronouncements by the institutions concerned. Second was the social media accounts of these institutions. At the same time, phone interviews for those who we managed to get direct access to. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was no opportunity for us to go to personally interview this because cities were in quarantine, provinces and regions were in quarantine. So most of the communications were done online and by social media. The fatwas given by the religious leaders and institutions were varied, and the responses were also varied. Now, whether we like it or not, in any disaster, minorities, whether religious, cultural, or sectoral minorities, would always experience disparity when it comes to the need to access certain things from the government. One example is persons with disabilities or the LGBTQ plus community, religious communities like the Muslims, cultural communities like the Filipino Muslims who belong to 13 ethno-linguistic tribes. Another thing that is important to look is how do these communities respond, these Filipino Muslim communities, to the current challenges that they face. In the Philippines, majority of the Filipino Muslims are centered in southern Philippines where they have faced several decades of armed conflict, which is gradually being addressed by the national government by creation of regional political entities, creation of national government agencies to address these concerns. COVID-19 in the Philippines was put into attention on January 30, 2020, when the first documented case of someone without a travel history abroad was a 62-year-old male who frequently visited a Muslim prayer area, a musalla in Green Hills, San Juan. At the same time, the issue wherein there was an ijtima in Malaysia where members of the Jamaat Tabligh movement attended, as well as the continuing incident that some of them proceeded to India. Now, the context of this paper is the Philippines, is like other countries, has been affected. Number two, what were the responses of this institution? Because institutions addressing Muslim concerns in the Philippines are composed of state and non-state actors. And how did the Muslim communities respond to them? So Muslim institutions in the Philippines, we can divide them into several categories. The first is the state institutions and agencies focusing on Filipino Muslims. The first is the National Commission on Muslim Filipinos, which addresses the concerns of Muslim Filipinos on a national level, their education, religious concerns like the Hajj, economic enterprises, cultural concerns, Muslim settlements, cemeteries, and even for providing policy guidance to national government agencies and to the Office of the President. The second is the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao, which was passed into existence during the early part of the Duterte administration as a result of the more than 2 decades of peace process with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. This composes of the former autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao and additional territories that were acquired through referendum. And thirdly is the Muslim Advisory Councils on every local government unit. Part of the concerns that was addressed by some local government units as directed by our Department of Interior and Local Government was the creation of Muslim Advisory Councils or Muslim Consultative Councils, where Muslim Filipinos form a significant percentage of the population. A council is provided to them so that they would be able to engage in governance through participatory democracy, where they directly engage the government by virtue of these councils. The next Muslim institution are religious organizations, which are independent. They have their own set of religious leaders, like the Basila Ulama Council, Sulu Ulama for Peace and Development, Majlisul Alal Tawita, which are provincial organizations. These are primarily Salafi ulama organizations that cater to the ulama that are Salafi. Next, regional organizations like the Majlisul Ulama Ahlus Sunnah Al-Shafi'iyah, which are Sunni Shafi Ashari Ulama, regional. This is in Zamboanga, Basilan, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi, as well as the Sabil al-Muhtadin, which is also another regional network of Sunni Ashari Shafi organizations. So these are religious organizations that cater to communities who follow their school of thought, and they have their own madrasa, they have their own masjids. And then the Darul Ifta, which is the center that issues religious guidance. Basically, in the Philippines, there are regional Darul Iftas. There is one in Region 11, which is southern Mindanao. Then there is the Bangsamoro Darul Ifta under ARM, and then there is the regional Darul Ifta of Region 9 and Palawan. So sometimes they interlap, but basically they are the ones that provide religious guidance. They declare when is the Ramadan. They declare when is the start of Eid, when is the start of Ramadan, when is the end of Eid or Hari Raya. And then we have individual madrasas that stand as independent madrasa. They have their own religious leaders. They may or may not follow the guidance provided by the regional Darul Ifta, but they may follow the advice given by national government agencies, such as the issuance that the president has declared a national holiday every year for Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitri. The president declared Eid al-Adha to be on May 25, that is Monday. And then the groups which belong to the different manahij or the schools of thought, like the Jama'at Tabligh, which is a very, very big religious movement in the Philippines. The Ahmadiyya, the Ahmadiyya Qadianiyya is one group which is present in the Philippines. The different Sufi orders in the Philippines, as well as the Shias. So there are around 9 different schools of thought in the Philippines. The indigenous Muslims in Malaysia, they're called as Islam Pondok. In the Philippines, it's called Islam Kamaasan. And then the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah Shafi'iyah, and then the Shia, and then the Salafiyah, and then the Sufi groups, and then the Jama'at Tabligh, the Turkish groups, Risale Nur, and the Hizmet movement, and then the Ahmadiyya movement. So there are 9 groups. So this is the myriad of institutions that are present in the Philippines that addresses Muslim concerns. Now, basically, before we proceed, I'd like to highlight some examples of what the different institutions did. For example, like the National Commission on Muslim Filipinos, on the start of the declaration of the state of public health emergency, called religious leaders in the National Capital Region, and then they released a statement asking for Muslims to cancel activities, religious gatherings, classes, group sessions. Also, the Majlis Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah Ashari Shafi'iyah, through its Facebook social media site Jambangan Surga, also issued a declaration. The Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao also issued a similar declaration. So, at the same time, I'd like to highlight some good examples, like in northern Luzon, the case of Masjid Anguilla. They convened their council, and then they consulted the religious scholars, and based on the decision of the religious scholars, they created a set of guidelines and protocols wherein they issued rules for their faithful, the Jama'ah in Alaminos, Pangasinan, what to do like they cancel their classes, congregational prayers, and then who would be allowed to go to the mosque and to the madrasa, and then how would they engage with the government. In Cebu City is geographically the middle part of the Philippines. The Muslim communities engaged with the National Commission of Muslim Filipinos and then took the announcement from the National Commission of Muslim Filipinos and asked the communities to comply with it. Now in Mindanao, each of the different organizations, institutions, and groups came out with their own individual policy statements on how Muslims should behave during the time of the pandemic. Now, what is important to highlight is during this period, because of the incident in Malaysia and India, the Johor Ijtima, that the Tablighs were faced with certain pressure as saying that they were the ones who brought the COVID-19 pandemic into the Philippines and in Mindanao. But social tracing and analysis of the curve is that it came from many sources. So it is not only the Tablighs who brought it in. At the same time, the world Amir, the global head of the Jamaat Tabligh movement, issued a statement that follow your local government and do address what are the things that government tells you to do. Practice social distancing, follow your elders, do sanitation, and then dispose of the dead properly. The Shia community took their guidance from the religious authorities. Shias in the Philippines followed the Maraji, or the religious authorities in Iran and in Iraq. Ayatollah Khamenei, the head of Iran, and Ayatollah Sistani, who provided systematic guidelines on how to behave in the corona crisis, at the same time highlighting that they should listen to government. While the Ahmadiyya community, even before the pandemic happened, they already were having discussions on how to address the COVID-19 crisis. So there was a set of guidelines sent to them that they follow, and then there's also an issue that they have to follow government. If we sum up the responses of all these Muslim religious institutions, there were several notable things that all of them agreed upon. Number one is all of these institutions suspended religious activities and programs until the threat of COVID-19 was over. Second was they agreed that they should abide by government directives so that they would be safe from COVID-19. Meaning whatever government tells them to do, like there was the government issues guidelines for enhanced community quarantine, where people in a certain area were subjected to a higher level of quarantine. And then there were some areas where there is only general community quarantine. So the movement of people were determined by this protocol set up by government. So almost all of these institutions stress that they should follow what the government is telling them in this regard. Number three is they also highlighted that they should do sanitation protocols for their facilities, personnel, families, like using disinfectant, practicing social distancing, and then praying at home. Next was they canceled the classes and the religious in the religious learning institutions, madrasa, mahad, toril. Some of the institutions were not able to send all of their students home because of when the enhanced quarantine and the general community quarantine were put into effect. Travel outside certain areas were already restricted, so they were stranded. But even though they were stranded in their religious learning institutions, they practiced social quarantine. And then they use the context of public interest and harm. In Islam, there is the primary sources of law is the Quran, the Sunnah, which is the practice of the Prophet, consensus of the scholars when they agree on an issue, and then logic, and then they include public interest when it is the safety of the community is at stake. Let's say there is violence, there is a health threat, then if there is a need to impose sanctions, discipline, then Muslims are obliged to follow it. So they use this public interest, maslaha and darura. Then they ask the Muslims to pray for the healing of the community and the country itself, because Filipino Muslims are part of the Philippines. They also included two important concerns in their discussions, like mental health, wherein they were asked to constantly communicate with others so that they wouldn't be they wouldn't be affected by mental health issues, and then they were advised on how to deal uh, with the dying. How should they bury the dead? In the Philippines, there was a protocol issued that all cases who died by COVID-19 should be cremated. However, the Department of Interior and Local Government and the Department of Health issued guidelines exempting Muslims from this protocol. Muslims, the Muslim ulama issued a guideline how to bury the dead. Like, if it is possible that it is the medical personnel who will already wash the dead, but if there is danger that they would be infected, then they would just wrap with the burial shroud. Muslims are buried with what we call the burial shroud, a long piece of white cloth, and then if it is possible that they will pray over the deceased, then they will pray. But if there is danger, then they will already bury it, and then they will pray in abstentia, meaning after the burial has been done. So in a way, Muslim religious leaders put this protocol, these types of guidance to follow while this COVID-19 pandemic happened. At the same time, communities followed and complied with them. There may be some initial confusion, but it was all clarified because one example was Region 11 and the Muslim Religious Advisory Council issued statements like social distancing. But when the Davao City government issued that they're suspending all religious activities, then the Darul Ifta of Region 11 complied also and agreed with the issuance of Davao City. Now, what is the basis of them providing these issues? Well, like all religious institutions, whether this is Christian, Buddhism, they use certain frameworks. The framework that they use, why they needed to advise them to be careful, was number one, of course, the Quran and the Sunnah, the prophetic injunctions on communicable disease. What they're saying is there's a hadith that mentions that if there is a plague in an area, you are not supposed to go towards it. And if you are caught in a place where there is plague, you should not flee from it, because there is a danger you may be infected already and you may spread the disease to other places, which may agree with certain concepts on herd immunity and community control. Second, of course, is what we have mentioned, the legal opinion of protecting communities from harm. And then they looked upon the scientific information that were provided to them, which made them come to a conclusion that they have to address this and provide guidance because COVID-19 is a communicable disease. If they do not advise the Muslim communities, then they would be infected by the virus. And then the responses from the national and local government, because when the national government issued executive orders and then issued the Bayanihan, We Heal as One Act, wherein guidelines were given on how movement of people, goods, and restrictions were put into place, then the religious leaders, the ulama, gave fatwa for the people that they should follow these rules. Now, what were the challenges? There were primarily two challenges that were faced by Muslim communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Number one is access to government support during the pandemic. Because of the criteria issued for those who would be allowed to receive aid from the government, many of these religious leaders and groups did not fall under these categories. So they faced challenges in how to access them. It was observed that while there was no centralized coordinating mechanism for religious organizations because they belong to different groups and different schools of thought. So they weren't able to, the support that came from the government was not able to trickle down to all of these institutions. I'd like to highlight that the government did its role to trickle down from the national government to the local government units. But because of the diversity of these religious organizations, not all of them were connected with the government, not all of them had access to government. So they were not able to directly tap into these social amelioration programs. There was some that were not able to gain access. And the Muslim concept of dignity, so if it's hard to gain access, we will just be patient with it until this is over. Non-government organizations also were totally dependent on external help. So many of these institutions relied on fund sourcing abroad to be able to share food packs. The second is students who were stranded, whether these were students from secular schools, state universities, private colleges, or the religious learning institutions. Many were not able to go home because, number one, of the lack of resources because transportation became more expensive. Number two is LGUs took time to be able to develop a response plan for their constituents who are studying in other places. And then number three, because of the quarantine measures instituted, then movement was really restricted. So the students, as a result, stayed. Some of them stayed at the institutions where they were studying, which affected the economic status of the school. Now, what way ahead do we see? What are the things that are the proposed interventions that should be done to improve the response of government to Muslim communities, and how would they engage with Muslim religious leaders during the time of COVID-19? Of course, number one is the presence of the government has created an interagency task force on COVID-19. These are all primarily government agencies, although there were business sector who partnered, but civil society organizations coming from the Muslim religious group should be included so that there would be representation and additional feedback. Number two is because many of these groups were not present or has access to government services, there should be an interdenominational council or a committee of Muslim religious organizations belonging to the different schools of thought, so that all of these groups will be able to gain access. Because as of the moment, most of the institutions that manage to gain access to government are Salafi religious institutions. The other religious institutions are not able to tap government. Number three is this council should be present in the National Commission on Muslim Filipinos to ensure that all of them would be serviced. And then the primary agency that addresses Muslim issues is the National Commission on Muslim Filipinos. But they only have a regional presence. They do not have a presence at the provincial and at the city level. So the protocol, the operating structure of the National Commission on Muslim Filipinos should be recalibrated so that it would have presence on a national level. National, regional, provincial, city, and even community level. And this entails that government should provide support to the agency to expand its operations because of its big mandate. With that, in summary, the response of Muslim religious institutions in the Philippines towards the COVID-19 pandemic was positive. Despite certain instances where they were not able to gain full access to support from government and other sources, but they managed to encourage the Muslim communities to be resilient in order to survive this crisis. And true to fact, because of the guidance provided by the Muslim religious leaders, the BARM, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao, has one of the lowest cases in COVID-19 cases, which proves that the role of Muslim religious institutions is a key role. With that, thank you very much. On behalf of Professor Sharima Morales and me, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon.
Okay, thank you so much, Yusuf. If you can hear us, and to Sharima, I will attempt to stop sharing. Okay. Let's see, we have some more questions. Maybe if there's something. Okay, so to all of the panelists, a question has come in. Have you witnessed any hostility from the locals during your time in the camp? Naomi, do you have anything to say to that, perhaps?
Well, I wouldn't really say hostilities, but what is happening in Ireland, like I had said before, the government hasn't really done enough in that there wasn't any thinning of people from direct provision centers. That's the camps where the people stay in, so to speak. And what happened is that we got clusters of COVID-19 in these direct provision centers and in the nursing homes. And actually what happened is that there was a cluster in one of the direct provision center where was more than 20 people in one center got COVID-19. And so there was a lot of fear and anxiety around that direct provision center. So to a point where they were actually locked in and they were not allowed to go out. And even after the 14 days, then there was an extension of another 14 days. So there was a lot of hostility from the community. And I wouldn't really call it hostility. I suppose it was fear in that people say, for example, in the supermarkets, didn't want these people going out to the supermarkets to buy their goods or going to the markets or whatever. So particularly in that one direct provision center, there was kind of tension between the migrants. And obviously that brings in all the right-wing kind of sentiments that we know about and about migrants, and they shouldn't be. Yeah, so we did see that in Ireland.
Okay, thank you very much, Naomi. Yeah, I've observed something similar. I wouldn't say hostility, but there was a lot of fear because social distancing is basically impossible in a lot of respects within the shelter I work at. And many people were purposely sleeping all day and being awake at night so that they didn't have to encounter other residents. And you can kind of imagine the psychological impacts of doing that for a while. Okay, and the organizer has told us there is another question in the chat. Please use the Q&A section for questions as it is visible to other attendees and easier to keep up with. Okay, I think I'm in that, but I'm not sure. And somebody says, not a question, but thank you to Naomi and Angela for their interesting presentation and important work. So, and Yusuf is there. He says, due to internet issues, I might not be able to reply to queries, but if anybody has a question for him, we could see if perhaps he could give a short response via chat. Okay. And maybe Tim, if you're still there, am I using the right Q&A section that you're referring to?
Well, at the moment you're looking at the chat, but the Q&A doesn't have a question in, so.
Okay, so check. Thank you.
If you are missing a question, I would tell you.
Okay, thank you very much. Great, then I guess we would be able to perhaps finish on time. So thank you for everybody who partook as a presenter and also everybody who tuned in, especially to my mom and dad who are up at 5 in the morning in New York right now. Thank you very much. And if you guys would like to continue the conversation, there is a Slack channel set up for each of the presentations. If you don't know what Slack is, just check the email that you received from the organizers and follow the link. It's pretty easy to sign up, and then we can keep the conversation going. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to see you all again sometime soon. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. God bless you guys.
Thanks, Courtney, for chairing.
Yeah, no problem.
Bye, everybody.
It was a blast.
Thank you. Bye.
And thanks for your presentations.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye. Stay safe. Yeah.
Thank you also. God bless.